Struggling a little on the breathing still.
Just because I didn't have any on.
Oh.
I'm gonna turn it on right now. I ran out last week, so.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. No, Kyle and Haley, are they going?
No, Haley and Chris, I think, are.
They're working, but
Oh,
they were gonna try to get done in time, but
Do we have paperwork?
all right. Not today. It was unexpected, I guess you could say, misunderstanding. So, we are in Genesis. We're going to do just a little bit of a recap on chapter 15 on some things. Then we'll get into Genesis chapter 16. We'll read through the text here and get ourselves familiar with that as we begin some of the discussion. So let's go ahead and start with the word prayer. Let's pray. Almighty Father above, we are so thankful to have today. Every day is truly a blessing from you. Father, we pray that you forgive us where we fall short of your glory and your goodness, and help us, Lord, to stay focused on you in this life and to resist the temptation that Satan throws our way, and help us, Lord, to rise above the world and take your way and your approach to things. And so help us to center our thoughts and our ways on yours. And now as we enter into the study, as we look through some things from the life of Abraham, your faithful servant, and we learn from his faith, help us, Lord, with the things we study tonight, and to be refreshed and encouraged and strengthened and renewed in our faith in various ways as we study these things. And it's in your Son and his holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So Genesis chapter 15 begins a reiteration from God of the promises. And specifically, you guys would have discussed last week that there were two promises that end up being addressed. In fact, the way that it starts off in chapter 15 and verse 1, that there seems to be some potential fear on Abraham's part. That the fact that God tells him, do not fear. So either there was the potential for the fear or some anxiety or whatever might have been going on for him, or that was just already happening for him. Why might he have been afraid? What do you think? What did you guys discuss on that last time? What were some things he might have been afraid of or concerning?
Concerned that he wouldn't have the promise that God knew that God wouldn't keep his promise to him.
Okay, so that he's thinking maybe it's taking God a long time. By the time we get into this next chapter, I mean, we've got 10, 11 years or so that have gone by since God has initially made the promise. Now, I'm going to double check and see because it does not feel like this is.
Always hot.
Yeah.
Oh, you're hot.
Are you guys hot? No.
Right,
Feels a little bit warm to me.
Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, you got it. So from the time that God would make the promise of an heir for him to the time that it actually is fulfilled, how much time would transpire? We're kind of looking ahead a little bit into how much time it's talked about. But Abraham is 75 when God initially makes that promise to him. Promise the land, promise to be a great nation, promise to have offspring. Through that offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Back in chapter 12, he's 75 there. And then by the time that they have Isaac, how old are they?
Yeah, 120.
So, no, he's 100 and Sarah is 90.
Oh, okay.
So, but still 25 years that goes by. That's a long time to wait for a promise to come about. Especially as people, we can be pretty impatient. So perhaps he's anxious about when this is going to happen. Because, I mean, really, the biological clock is ticking. In fact, they're already past childbearing age. So this doesn't seem like it's looking good. The more time that goes on, it seems like this is going to get harder and harder. But one of the things to be keeping in mind and for him to grow in and for all of us to grow in is that God can do the impossible. And that's part of this picture here, that it doesn't matter how much time goes by, God can still make it happen. And I think there's another possibility of some fear that he's facing, and I don't know if this has to do with this or not, but in chapter 14, he just finished a great feat, right? He defeats a big army. He recovers his nephew Lot, and he even takes some of the spoils and everything from all of that. That's a huge, huge thing. Is it not safe to say God was with him in all of that? Because it was him and how many people?
318 of his people that we know of.
Yeah, 318 of his men
Trained men.
in this process. Almost makes you think of Gideon in the period of the Judges, looking into the future from this point. But the period of Gideon and the men, and God keeps cutting his army size down. It says, you've got too many people to go to war against 200,000. And he has 10,000. And he says, nope, you need to cut it down more. And gets all the way down to an army of 300, right? So, and all of that to show that God's the one behind it all. So God clearly was with Abram in chapter 14 and the great accomplishments. But after the dust settles from all of that, so that the defeat of 5 kings, right? Because it was 4 kings against 5. The defeat of the 5 kings, but then maybe there's a sort of looking over your shoulder. Are they going to come after me? And so maybe there's some fear and trepidation there that starts to set. It's interesting how after success, all of a sudden, sometimes we start to question our success, or we start to wonder or wait for, okay, when's the ball going to drop on something bad to happen? It can't always be going good. Something bad is bound to be happening here. Or what if they come after us? So there may be some fear there as well. But this fear seems to be something God reassures him. He says, I am a shield to you. So I'm a protection to you. So maybe that speaks to that. But then he also says, your reward shall be very great. And so then it makes us think, well, maybe he's talking about the reward. But maybe this is fear on, maybe he's got anxiety and fear on different levels concerning different things. He's got a lot weighing on his mind. Maybe it's not just one single thing. And so he does speak to this about his reward being very great. Now, Abram has already been rewarded greatly in life, hasn't he? He's a rich fellow. He's come out of Egypt. When he was down there, he flourished. He was given many gifts from the Egyptians. And so this man is really, he's a rich man. He's a wealthy man. And God says your reward will be very great. And yet, so the one thing that's been weighing on them is we don't have a kid. And so he brings this up to God, right? When he says, verse 2 of chapter 15, "O Lord, what will you give me since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" It's almost like now he's bringing this up and specifically asking, what are you going to give me? When God had already promised him, it's almost like, it doesn't seem like you're sticking to the promise that you gave, or like you had somehow forgotten about it. And so it's almost like he's been making plans in his own mind, because he says, here's the heir that I've got in my house, Eliezer of Damascus. And he says, so that's what we've got lined up. I've got him in my will, whatever it is. And then God does something very fascinating when he, after Abram specifically accuses God of giving him no offspring. So, you really haven't done anything for me here, God, on that front. And that's a pretty bold thing to talk to God about, and to accuse him of not following through and not being faithful to his promise. But God didn't promise when, right? And so we got to be careful that we're not, putting on God something that he hasn't, stated for us. But here, he's got a time expectation. And so with this, God then says in verse 4 and 5, first he says, hey, the plans you're making with this Eliezer, he's not going to be the heir. So stop thinking like that. And then there's going to be one from your own body. You will have your own actual descendant who will be the heir. And then to help give him proof, because this is what Abram's asking for, right? He's asking for proof. How can I know? How can I know that I'm actually going to have an heir? And so how does God prove it to him?
I don't know if I'd call it proof, but he showed him the stars and said it's going to be like this.
Yes, so he says, go ahead, take a look up at the stars. And go ahead and start counting them and see. And that's what your descendants is going to be like. All of these stars, innumerable. You're going to have so many beyond, you can't even count them all. Now, I think it's fascinating. Oh, were you going to say something, Ernie?
Oh, I was just going to say, we talked about last week that the fact that it's within a vision has another layer of truth to it. Like everything that's being said is truth because of the vision nature, the miraculous nature of this kind of communication with God.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that, well, like you said, I'm not sure if it's so much proof as it is reassurance. But how is telling him to look at the stars reassurance? First, where did the stars come from? God put those there. Not only that, how often are the stars there? Every night. They're always in the sky without fail. They're never not there. In fact, would you be absolutely shocked if the stars were there or were not there tonight? I'd actually be very surprised. I would say something is wrong because those are not in the sky. They've always been in the sky. There's never been a time in this whole wide world when they've not been in the sky. And so I think God's actually doing something very fantastic here of saying, here you go. You want something to reassure you of what I'm promising? You're going to be able to look up at the sky every night and go ahead and try and count them. See if you can do it. But you're going to be able to see those stars, and every time you see those stars, every day you are going to have a reminder of my promise.
And of God's power, like you said.
And of God's
that
power.
He had made the stars.
Of his faithfulness that he's already shown through that. So I think that's actually, so it's not just about how many stars are in the sky. I think there's a whole lot more to this, that God uses that. And what a fantastic thing. Doesn't he do that with us today too, where he keeps trying to show us and have us look at the things that are constant reminders of his faithfulness, of his greatness, of his power. We just came back from Lake Powell, and I tell you, being out on Lake Powell on the houseboat and having our fun in the water, but looking around. Thankfully, the houseboat is actually very slow, just putting along, because all we could do was just sit and take in the scenery, the beauty of it all. And not just that it's beautiful, you know what started to cross my mind was looking and seeing, so you have the flat tops of all of these, right? And I'm going, that used to be the floor. That used to be the basin. When did all of this erode? The flood was when all this went down. We're here observing this worldwide of biblical proportions catastrophe that affected all of the landscape in the world and eroded all of this to where it's down to this canyon that we're floating in and having our fun. And so all this reminder of the power of God, the promise of God, the judgment of God through the flood. I mean, all these things start to come to mind. We have week in and week out this meal that we take. We call it, well, the supper. Jesus, the Lord Supper. His supper. Bread, simple thing of bread and simple thing of fruit of the vine that we take. That is a regular weekly reminder for us of God's promise, of God's cleansing, of God's forgiveness, of God's love, of his kindness, of his faithfulness to us. And he says, I don't want you to forget. And this is the same thing that he's doing through Abraham. So God's very much in the business of showing and giving us reminders. The thing is if we stop looking at the reminders, we stop paying attention to those, then we kind of end up in a place where Abram, was starting to wonder and starting to doubt and starting to fear and all that kind of stuff. So there's a great message here about what helps us conquer our anxieties and our fears is when we focus on what God can do and what God does and has faithfully done in our lives. We sing a song, count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your many blessings, every doubt will fly. All of that really speaks to us in our faith lesson of really focusing on what he has promised in so many great ways in his power and might. All right, so there's that lesson in that, and then he ends up in this. It's interesting. Right after all that, verse 6 is where it says, "Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness." Right, so that's the statement that is quoted in the New Testament, and you guys talked about that last week as far as the different references in the New Testament. But Here he reckons it to him as righteousness because he believed. He believed what? God just said, look at the stars. This is what I'm going to do. Those will remind you. And he went, okay. Now that is the kind of faith that God says, I really like. The kind that takes what I say and it says, okay. When it's hard to believe it, because I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know how God's going to do it. Because has God even explained anything about the ins and outs of it? How he's going to make it happen? All he has said is, I'm going to do it. Just know that. Just know that I'm going to do it. And I think there's something to that where God says, I really love. And this is what righteousness is really centered around. Is this kind of a belief that simply hears what God says and believes every word of it because it says something about who he is and what he's going to do, and it trusts that God is going to do it. And God says that's the kind of person who will listen to me. That's where righteousness is really going to be stemming from, is a heart that's really just is going to believe in me, even though it has lots of questions along the way. Then the next thing is he has a question because God says, hey, I'm also going to bless you with this land. This is great reward. And he says, yeah, but how will I know that I shall possess it? More proof he wants. You notice God made a statement about himself that served as another proving statement of how Abraham could know that he was going to possess the land. How could he know? Verse 7, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. What do you need to know about the Lord? He's identified some characteristics about himself. I'm the one who brought you out. Don't you? You didn't just up and leave Ur of the Chaldees on your own. I called you out of it, and I helped you all along the way. So there's that. But then he still asks the question. I think this is interesting. If he believed in verse 6, and the Lord reckoned it to him as, counted it to him as righteousness, what would you call this right now? Is he believe in the Lord right now? How will I know that I shall possess it? Well, we just finished talking about, the promise of a child. This is a completely different subject now, God. So what about this one? And then he has him bring animals, right? So this is interesting what God tells him to do. He says, you want to know how to know you'll possess it? You want to know what proof I'm going to give you? You go and get some animals, so 5 different animals, and bring them here for a sacrifice. What else does God say at that point? That's it. He says, just bring me sacrifices. He gets them, he brings them. So a heifer that's 3 years old, right? And a female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And then he takes the bigger animals and he cuts those in half, right? Which seems to be a practice of covenant making that was going on in those times. And so they would cut the piece in half, or cut the animal in half, and then both parties would walk through it as a way of, okay, we have an accord here, we have an agreement, we have a covenant. But in this instance, there's only one who walks through, who passes through the 2 pieces, and who is it? It's God. It's God who passes through the 2 pieces. And what's interesting, though, is how long does Abram have to wait before he even knows? He's still waiting for an answer. How will I know that I'm going to possess the land? God says, tell you what, get some animals, bring them here. And he does it. He cuts them in half. and he waits to the point that buzzards are trying to come and get him, and he's shooing them off, and he's protecting these. And then nightfall, right? He waits however long throughout the day. Okay, I got these ready. What are we going to do now? And then God goes ahead and then speaks to him. There's fear that comes upon him, right? Verse 17. It came out when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven, a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces. Back in verse 12, it said a deep sleep had fallen upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. A terror, so the phrase there, terror and great darkness, or a terror of great darkness. In other words, darkness hit. Great darkness fell. Now, was it messing with him? There's some different things from commentators on that. But either way, here God appears in this passing through the animal. But before he does that, now God speaks and he says some things to him. Verse 13, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. So now he's talking about the descendants. He's talking about them inheriting the land. But how long is it going to be before they inherit the land? It's going to be 400 years before they're even going to get the land. You want to talk about a long time to wait. Abram is never going to see that in his lifetime. And his descendants, some of his descendants are never even going to see that in their own lifetime. But why is he waiting so long to make that promise happen? Why would God wait so long to do such a thing? In fact, so long that it means waiting through a period of time where they're going to be oppressed in Egypt. Why would God wait for all that horrible oppression to happen for them and for multiple generations to go by, for 400 years to happen? Isn't that long enough of a suffering? Why, God, why? The answer is actually in verse 16. Then in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. Now, you guys have heard me talk about this before. But what's he saying about why he's going to wait 400 years before he brings them out of Egypt, Abraham's descendants, out of Egypt and into the land that he promised them? The land where Abraham is now, currently. Why wait? Verse 16.
We're going to conquer the Amorites.
Yeah, so it says the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And so God's saying, hey, I want you to know something about me, because he did mention verse 14 after he talked about they're going to be enslaved and they're going to be oppressed for 400 years. But what he says, verse 14, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. So I'm going to do some judging here. So who's God going to judge? He's going to judge the Egyptians, but he's also going to judge the Amorites as well. Amorites are one of the big groups who are like neighbors in the land, and they are some of the big wigs in the land. And so sort of like the Canaanites were also big in the land. And in fact, Canaanites and a number of others, the Amorites and the Canaanites and a number of other ites are mentioned at the end of this chapter. It's sort of like, here are a lot of the other families or other, nations or sub-nations as well. They're going to be part of this whole thing, yeah.
Weren't the Amorites one of the nations that wouldn't let them cross their land when
Yes.
they were going through the wilderness, right?
The Amorites, the Amalekites as well, were, in fact, the Amalekites were initially really bad about it, didn't want to let them pass through. So the Amorites here, he says, their sin is not yet complete, so God's actually going to be patient and wait for them to still make choices about what they're going to be doing with their lives. Whether or not they'll listen to or follow God and seek Him, or if they'll continue in their sin. And God says, but when their sin is complete, that's how long I'm willing to wait for them before it's sort of like the nails in the coffin by virtue of what they're doing with their lives. And He goes, then I'm going to actually use you. You're going to go in and take over the land. And you're going to drive out. You're going to kill people like the Amorites and the Canaanites and a number of these other ites. And you're going to either kill them or you're going to drive them out of the land. It's interesting how God is going to be patient to wait to see what they do with their hearts. Even though He knows they're going to continue down a path of sin, He's still giving them the opportunity. And so sometimes, and here's a lesson for us, sometimes the good or those who are with God sometimes must go through a period of having to endure and suffer while God is patiently waiting on His judgment to mete it out on people for their sins. And in this case, He's going to bless the Israelites, the descendants of Abram, bless them with the land, but in blessing them, it's going to serve as judgment for all the other nations as they go in and kill them. So it really speaks to answering the question of why does God, why does God even promote killing? Why would God tell them to kill even, nations and wipe them out? And even not just the men, and not just the men of war, but the women and the children, all of that. Because God says, I've given them so many opportunities to change, and they haven't. The cycle has got to stop. And so He's going to use them. So that's kind of what that's about, really, from verse 16 and what He's telling them and why so much time. So that's a good faith lesson there. And then looking at getting into chapter 16 then, and I mean all the names at the end of chapter 15, these are all descendants of who? Going back to, well, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These are all Ham descendants, and Ham being the son of Noah who was cursed because of what he did. These are all descendants who were nations who were evil nations. All right, chapter 16, let's get into some of this. Oh, did you guys notice, by the way, when God promised in verse 18 about the borders of the land, what they would get to have? They would get to have this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, which Euphrates, that was one of the rivers flowing out of the Garden of Eden, right? And then the great river of Egypt, I'm thinking the Nile, all the way there, or maybe one of the other rivers somewhere that feeds into the Red Sea. Well, either way, do they end up possessing the land all the way to the Euphrates? Where's the Euphrates?
It's a lot further east.
That's way over by Babylon. So when you look at all of that, it's so far away from where they actually end up settling in and what they have. But then again, when they go and conquering the land, they didn't end up conquering all of the land. Isn't that right? So they kind of stopped short of all the things when looking ahead into the book of Exodus. All right, chapter 16 here. Now we have a new phase. And I don't know how much time has gone by, but we're going to see a situation with Abram and Sarai. And it concerns God's promise. It's interesting that chapter 15 ends up being about God's promise. promises and reassuring Abram of the promises and the reward. Now chapter 16 concerns itself with them thinking and trying to work out, how is God going to bring about his promise? They're concerned about the how. God has not talked about the how. Now they're trying to whittle on God's end of the stick. Let's take a look at this. Let's go ahead and read in this. So chapter 16, beginning verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Verse 5. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Let's actually pause here. Let's talk about verses 1 through 6 right now and see what we're seeing just about the circumstance at hand. So, there's a plan, a scheming that's going on here. Whose idea is this plan for childbearing?
Sarah's.
Okay, Sarah's. So why does she have this plan? And first, what is the plan that she concocts?
Have Abraham have a child with her maidservant.
Yeah. Hagar, they had acquired her when they were in Egypt. Remember, they had acquired a lot of servants, and so Hagar would have been one of those. And so she says, all right, Abram, you're going to take her as wife. I mean, at least let's look at this and say, okay, at least he's taking her as a wife and not just, not just sleeping around or whatever. But is this not, what she's proposing here, is this not strange to our American ears? Mm-hmm. And to our culture? This is a strange thing. It's one spouse and that's it. But something that was regularly practiced at this time was polygamy, right? And just understand something about polygamy is that when God did end up allowing it along the way, is that the way he designed it to be? Mm-mm. No, because how did he make it in the garden? He didn't make Adam and a couple of wives. It was just Adam and Eve. So God's original intent was one man, one woman, together for life. But something that polygamy actually facilitated along the way was financial provision for these women along the way. So culturally speaking, it was one of the ways that women found themselves financially secure, as you'd have a couple women married to the same guy, and he,
Not only are more women born, but men die more often because of the warfare and things
Sure.
like that.
Sure. Yeah. And so, so this is something this is just telling us a story of what happened. And notice it doesn't necessarily say that God condemned them for it, but at the same time, God does step in here, doesn't he? What happens from Sarah's end and from Abram's end? So it's, why is it her idea for Abram to marry her servant Hagar and to have a kid together? Why does she come up with this? Ladies, does this not sound like a crazy idea to you? Like, what woman in her right mind would suggest such a thing? Look, go ahead.
To see who is having a problem having the baby. Is it Sarah?
Okay. Yeah, because so it's clearly she's not able to have a kid. In fact, she makes a notation about her inability to have a child. What notation, what statement does she make about her inability to have a child?
Lord has prevented me.
The Lord has prevented me. It's not just, I don't know, the body's just not working right. The Lord has prevented me, she says. What do you think about that statement? True or not true?
Yes.
Again, true or not true? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes. I stand behind every word I said.
So God has his plan,
Yeah.
and he knows what his plan is. So, you know, he gives us free will, but he also, you know, he does things that, you know, help his plan to work out the way it's going to work. He wants it to work out.
Yeah.
And so, you know, maybe it was him who prevented her from having a baby with Abram until the right time.
Yeah, we know it's his miracle. From him. It would be the child of promise from God.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, really, you'll see this, we see it in Job, we see it here, that the way that they viewed life, and they viewed cause and effect and all of that God was the reason behind everything that took place, and that it was his, you know, in his decision, it was for the good. However, even if it seemed like something bad, like Job and his suffering, his children dying, as I talked about in a lesson, 2 weeks ago, those things happening, well, God's the reason behind it because he's the creator and the author of all things, right? And so if there's going to be something bad that happens, we're going to say God has a reason behind it. This is how they kind of thought, that God is behind everything, whether preventative or what's the opposite of preventative? Permissive, proactive, proactively doing something. And so, well, I don't know why. Here she is. I don't know why, but God has prevented me from being able to do this. Because when I look around, I see the way that all of mankind works and the way reproduction works. So many women are able to have kids, but I'm not. So God's got to be holding back on me for some reason. So this is interesting. If she believes that God is stepping in and preventing her, then what are you going to do about that?
If you can prevent it, you can make it happen.
But then she's going against God.
Yeah. And is this a statement about her and faith and lack of faith in God?
I always thought she was just trying to help him out.
Yeah.
There's got to be a way. I'm supposed to be doing something and I'm missing it.
Don't you think that up to this point they had been trying to, well, look, faith without works is dead, right? So if we say we believe in God,
Gotta do something.
then we're not just going to sit here and expect a baby to, a stork to fly a baby in and drop it off for us, maybe to fall out of the sky. We know how this works. So, hey, I imagine they were busy with their part too, right? There's God saying, I promise I'm going to do my part, but they also know how babies come into the world. So, but that part of the process isn't working. So this is interesting. They're learning something that no matter how hard they try, they can't make it happen. Has that ever been frustrating to you? No matter how hard you try, and you just, something that should be able to happen, and it's not happening. And then you start to wonder, God, are you really, are you mad at me? Is there something wrong here? God's holding back on me. God's not helping, or whatever. And this is kind of where she is. It's almost like she's at a loss. Can you not sense the pain and the discouragement that she's experiencing right now? God said this was going to happen. And it should not take as many times and as many years as it has taken for a baby to happen. So something's wrong. And I just don't understand why God is stopping this from happening. So that's how she sees it. So as a way of, well, look, God said that, what did he promise Abram? Eliezer is not going to be the heir.
Seed promise.
What's that seed promise? There is going to be an offspring from your own body, Abram. From your own body. Well, he did say to Abram from his own body.
From Sarah's own body.
And so if he takes Hagar, it's still going to be a descendant from his own body. And then we'll have God's promise coming about. And it almost seems like they're getting anxious again because they're looking at it going, so much time's gone by. We're not spring chickens. This isn't working out. So then, how does Abram take her idea? How does he respond to it?
Whatever you want.
All right, if that's what you want. This really makes me think of kind of the story of Adam and Eve a little bit in the garden, right? And Eve goes, well, you know what? I think it actually is a good thing if we just go ahead and take this fruit. Because what did Satan say? What did the serpent say was going to happen if they ate it? You will become like God, knowing good and evil. And in the day that you eat of it, you won't die. So, telling some lies, telling some partial truths, but you'll become more like God. You'll know good and evil. And oh, hey, you know what? Good things can come from this. And so then where's Adam in the midst of all this? She hands him the fruit.
Yeah,
And he goes, no, okay.
Yeah, he's being a follower just like Abraham is.
Yeah.
When men refuse to take the spiritual leadership of the family, bad things happen.
So there is a message I think we're seeing in here about male spiritual leadership when it fails, right? And here, should Abram have stepped in and said, that's not the plan, that's not a good idea?
Mm-hmm.
He should have. Should Adam have swatted the fruit out of Eve's hand? Or said, when she went to grab at it, no, what are you doing? Something along those lines, but instead went along with what Eve's idea was that she had. When it was readily apparent that it wasn't right reasoning, right? Does this seem like right reasoning at all in any way? I mean, for them, let's do this. I mean, looking at Abram and Sarai, we're kind of standing in a little bit of judgment of them right now, aren't we? Like, come on, you guys, really?
We have 20/20 vision.
We look back. We've got the hindsight. We have the 20/20 vision. Be able to look at it and say, but what if our failures to follow God or to really hang on His promises and our anxieties and our fears that caused us to make some bad decisions and thwart His promise and His plan, And what if our failures or our bad decisions in that way were spread around to just even among the congregation here, for everyone to sit and go, oh, you idiot, what were you thinking? We can be kind of hard on some of these characters when we know how the story plays out. And why didn't you know that, well, how many of us know what tomorrow's even going to bring, right? Which really comes back to then, trust in what the Lord has said. This belief that God counted to him as righteousness is the thing that it needs some reinforcement along the way, but in the end, Abraham keeps hanging on to it, even when it's not always, it's sort of like doing a graph, it's almost like a heart reading on a monitor or something like that, beep, it's beep, and then it's kind of flatlining for a little bit, it almost seems. So before we get too, judgmental about them, can we not see how they are, where they are, and some of the anxiety that's there for them, and wondering how's God's promise going to come about? We've got to do our part. In fact, don't we teach that about faith? Look, faith is not just sitting back waiting for God to, drop everything in your lap, but that we're doers of his will. And we've got to be doers, because that's what faith is. And so here it's almost like they're going, well, we got to do. How are we going to do? How are we going to make sure on our end this is working out? So this happens, right? Abram goes along with it, takes Hagar as his wife. She conceives, and then what happens? Verse 4 and 5.
Oh, yeah, she's all haughty with Sarah, so Sarah's like, what? That's not right.
Yeah. She despised her in her sight. So can you feel the daggers coming out of her eyes?
Mm-hmm.
The laser beams, whatever it is, the jealousy burning within.
Or, I thought it was more like, I'm so much better than you. I'm going to have the child.
Yeah.
You couldn't even you couldn't even get pregnant.
Yeah, she despises her, which is a looking down upon somebody, right? Like, you just had to go and have a kid, didn't you? And prove that I couldn't. I don't know, that's how I'm looking at it, but what are you talking about?
Hagar was despising Sarah. Sarah wasn't despising her. Hagar looked on her was.
Oh, yeah, you know what,
Yeah.
sorry, I guess,
Yeah,
I guess I was looking at this wrong.
Yeah.
She saw, so made the verse 4. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. Oh, yeah. So she's despising Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah. Okay, I had that flipped around for some reason. So Hagar then is looking like, why do you think she's despising her? Why do you think Hagar's despising Sarah?
She's proud and arrogant. It's the pride of life, Look
Yeah.
at me. I got pregnant, you didn't. I'm going to have the heir. I'm going to have special status now.
Yeah, either way you look at this, here's like a love triangle situation, right? It's kind of what almost is going on. And I'm able to have the kid, and this was all your idea. Tell me she didn't know that this was her idea, right?
Mark, girls.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
There's just some things there that, coaching girls, you see it, they tend to tear each other down instead of build each other up.
Yeah.
And it's, it happens a lot.
It's the comparison business that's going on. And this is where, and it just as human beings, we find ourselves doing it in one way, shape, or form. But in this case, it's between these two women, right? And whether it's fighting over a man, it's like we're going to see this similar kind of scenario playing out later in Genesis, right? When you've got Jacob, right? Jacob, when he wants to marry Rachel, but he has to work for Laban, for Rachel's dad, for 7 years, and he works 7 years for him. And he says, okay, now you can have my daughter, but he gives him Leah, the older sister, because you can't get rid of the younger sister first. You got to get rid of the older one first. And so he tricks him. Of course, they have the face coverings, all this kind of stuff. And so I guess, he was tricked. And so then he has to work another 7 years for Rachel, and he does, and he loves Rachel more than Leah, but now he's got these two women, and then Rachel struggles with having children, kind of a thing. Leah's able to bear children, but he doesn't love Leah like he loves Rachel. And I mean, it's just all of this, right, that's happening here. All right, so what does Sarai have to say? So she's getting the vibe from Hagar that she hates her.
Well, she kind of puts it on Abram.
It is his fault.
Hey, how are you letting this happen?
Yeah.
May the wrong done to me be done to you, because she's looking down on me, looking at me with contempt.
Yeah.
And Abram's probably going,
Yeah.
because he's a guy, he doesn't know, he has no idea what's going on.
Yeah, you went a little too strong with the love on this end over here, man. Whatever it is, now she wants Abram to experience. I wish you could experience what I'm experiencing. I mean, right, that's kind of what seems to be here. So then, verse 6, how does Abram respond to this? I mean, she even called on God to be a judge between the both of them, right? Sounds like a little bit of a family feud going on here. And I tell you what, may God judge between you and me and how you've dealt with this. How is Abram at fault?
Because what we said before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he didn't step up in the first place and say, no, this is not a good idea. We should not be doing this, right?
So now he does, though, recognize her as his wife.
Yeah.
And puts her in that first place.
Okay.
But there's still consequences that have already.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
So he gives her that up. He says, "Do with her what you will."
yeah.
But yeah.
She's your handmaid. So you want to do something with her? You go ahead and do it.
And
And
Hagar would have been humble. I'm just speculating. If she would have been humble and still had that servant heart, like, I'm serving you guys, you're my family, it would have been different.
yeah, so many interesting facets in this.
Not that Ishmael would be the son promise, but that, I don't know. It's always seemed really harsh to me that she was driven away.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is what we're going to see and talk about more next time is how Sarai's actions toward Hagar end up driving Hagar and Ishmael away. But then God is going to step in now. And this is interesting to see. God lets these things unfold this way, and then he steps in to make right some of the wrong things that have gone on in all of this, right? It's really neat to see what God's going to do, and yet something that God does in this is also going to create problems that have resulted even to today, and some of the warrings and the infightings that go on between these two different nations that'll come from Isaac and from Ishmael. So Islam and Israel. Never-ending feud. So if you weren't aware, Ishmael brings about the nation of Islam. And they're, even currently today, what sits in the place of the temple in Jerusalem? mosque. And so the Muslims have infiltrated, they put their own mosque there. You know, there's the Holy Land battles have not ceased. Whose land is it? And it all comes back down to what we're going to see transpire in this chapter and the next chapter with what God does with Ishmael, what promise God has made through Abraham, and Abraham's descendant. Is Ishmael a descendant of Abram?
Mhm.
Is he the intended recipient of the land promise? No, but that's a hard one for them to try and reason out. So all the arguing, that's still infighting, that still goes on. All right, so we'll pause there, and I will have some things, some lesson sheets to hand out for chapter 16, so that way you can study for the rest of the chapter. I'll get that to you by Sunday, and so you can have that. All right, anything else? All right, let's go ahead and close with a prayer, and then we'll conclude tonight. Amy stayed home with Levi because Levi wasn't feeling good tonight, and then Seth is with Robin and Cheryl. They're still gone for the rest of this week. Seth has his trap shoot for the Nationals in Las Vegas this coming Friday, Saturday. So that's where they are. Anything else? Brett and Christy were not able to be here. They're back helping his dad and trying to deal with that. So, all right. Well, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Mark, would you lead us in that, please?
Yeah, let's pray. Dear God, our Father in heaven, we thank you for this evening and letting us look at the life of Abram and Sarai and just the wonderful things that you do, Father, that help us to learn about faith. We pray, Lord, that you would bless us in this, help our minds be open to your word and your wisdom. Help us to try to apply the things that you teach us